Bonjour, welcome to today's live Lunch and Learn presented as part of the EMSB ParentCon 2023. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Marika Ramundo, and I'm a parent volunteer on the English Montreal School Board's Parents Committee. Next slide. We are all here live in numerous locations. I would like to take this time to recognize that the English Montreal School Board is located on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Kanien'kehá:ka. We are grateful to live, learn, and work in the Teotihuacan, which has long been a site of meeting and exchange for many First Nations and is currently home to diverse groups of Indigenous and other peoples. It is important that we acknowledge the historic and ongoing role of educational institutions in perpetuating injustices against Indigenous communities. We are committed to educating staff, students, and parents about the true history and current realities of the Indigenous peoples of what we now call Canada. Celebrating the cultures, contributions, and knowledge of many First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities, listening to and amplifying Indigenous voices, and partnering with local Indigenous communities, we offer this acknowledgement as a first step and public commitment to our ongoing process towards reconciliation and justice for Indigenous peoples and communities. Next slide. For those of you who have never attended this event before, it's organized by the English Montreal School Board Parents Committee. The committee is a government-mandated body that represents all EMSB parents. We inform the EMSB of parents' needs, advise the EMSB on related issues, and our members represent parents on EMSB committees and the Council of Commissioners. We also promote and encourage different ways for parents to connect with each other. Our annual events like this Lunch and Learn are just some of the ways that we try to build a community. The purpose of this event is to provide you with some valuable information, some tips and strategies to help you navigate the joys and challenges of parenting. We believe that every parent deserves access to tools and resources they need to succeed in their role. We hope you enjoy this opportunity to learn from experts and gain valuable information to help your child thrive. So, Unchair. Oh, we are unchaired. Yay. Before we get to our main programming, we have some housekeeping details we want to relay. There are two ways that folks can access this talk. We've provided guests with a Zoom link and with a live stream on YouTube. There's going to be a Q&A after the main presentation. We invite you to enter your questions into the chat box or the comment field on either of those streams. Now on to today's talk. Today's presentation on cultural diversity and racism invites us to critically reflect on issues related to race, ethnicity, and racism in order to create a more egalitarian, inclusive, and society that's open to diversity. I would like to introduce Dylan Michael Lord, workshop facilitator from Ensemble pour le respect de la diversité. Dylan has been at Ensemble for 4 years. He speaks to thousands of youth yearly about issues that affect him as someone that is queer and a person of color. He has much professional experience to draw from as well, with 6 years working with Inuit and Indigenous populations in Canada through education and social services. Finally, with a degree in international development, Dylan finds himself very much at home with Ensemble. Dylan, the mic is yours.
All right, hey everybody. I'm so not used to getting introductions like that. I don't take myself too seriously.
Recording in progress.
It's very strange for me to hear somebody talk about me like that, but thank you. That is a great introduction. Yeah, so I'm just gonna share my PowerPoint. Just so we are good to go. Okay. Can everybody see the PowerPoint? They cannot. Yes? Yes? Okay, cool. Let me just adjust so that I can see all the chat heads. 1 second. Cool. Technology. Okay. Sorry, everybody. You know how it is with the virtual. Got to adjust. I'm just making sure that I can see the chat. It's good. And chat. Sorry, I'm using 2 screens. Yeah, so I'm making the chat available on my screen so that if anybody feels comfortable participating through messages or what have you, instead of having to turn on their mic, you can totally just use the chat. And that's yeah. So, I've been introduced. For those of you that haven't heard of our organization, Ensemble pour le respect de la diversité, we're an organization based in Montreal that's been around for about more than 25 years. We do workshops like this one, mostly for students from grades 4 all the way up to Sec 5, talking about social justice in general. And we also do projects with schools across the country, across the province, where it's for and by youth when they want to take action in their environments, be in school, depending on whatever the issue is. So those are the two things we do as an organization. And yeah, feel free to participate, strongly encouraged. Um, I think you have the option of raising the electronic hand, so do that if you feel like turning the mic on. Like I said, the chat's available as well. And yeah, I'm not here to force anybody to think like me. You're allowed to have your own opinions. You're allowed to disagree. As long as we're being respectful, I think it's fine. And as long as we have arguments as to why we think a certain way or points, I think it's fine. So I like having conversations. So please don't hesitate. If you have something or if you want to correct me also, that's completely fine. Like I don't know everything. So yeah, let's get started. So we're talking about racism today, right? And we do this kind of little joke with the kids sometimes when we do this workshop. And we ask them, hey, we want to do a little survey. What are the races? How many races are there in your school? And some kids will be like, oh my God, there's so many. There's the Black people, there's the First Nations people, there's the Latinos, there's the Muslims, there's the Asians. And we're like, oh my God, guys, they're using all kinds of things, right? They're using the color of their skin, they're using geography, they're using language. So, something I know that parents today want to have ways to talk about race and things like that with their kids. First and foremost, I think we're all aware that race biologically is not a thing. And just in the way that people answer that question, using color of skin, language, and things like that, you're using all types of criteria to create this idea of race. So scientifically, it doesn't exist. We share 99.9% of the same DNA. We're part of the same species, so that's not a thing. But we have to be careful sometimes of becoming colorblind, where sometimes you'll hear people say things like, oh, I don't see color. Oh, everybody's the same to me, which is a good, whoops, sorry, cars driving, which is a good sentiment in and of itself. I would like to live in a world where there's no racism, but what can happen is that if you say things like, I don't see color or everybody's the same, you don't see the fact that people are treated differently because of it, right? So there's a balance to be had as far as saying, okay, race doesn't exist scientifically, biologically, but socially, it's something that we've constructed, unfortunately, to justify being racist or discriminatory towards people because of their color of skin, because of the language they speak, because of their religion, because of where they're from, right? So just having that as sometimes maybe a point or an argument to bring across, if that's something you have to deconstruct with kids, can be a good way to talk about it, of having that balance and that nuance when we talk about race. It's very complicated when we talk about racism. There's entire university courses about this. Um, but something simple just for today in the interest of time that I like to use is this little, cool, this little equation. One second, I'm noticing that my computer is low on battery. I'm just gonna plug in my charger. Okay. Thank you, Cata. Uh, yeah, so it's a very simple equation, prejudice plus power, right? So when we talk about this, what we basically say is that there's prejudice that exists for everybody, um, irrespective of what the group is, right? So that in and of itself, it doesn't make it okay, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's racism. If there's just prejudice, for example, we talk about minority and majority dynamics, right? If we talk about color of skin, what is the majority color of skin in Canada, Quebec, or Montreal? It's being white, right? So is there prejudice towards white people? Yes, things like it's little funny things like they don't know how to dance, no spice in the food, like Starbucks, stuff like that, right? So even if it's a majority group, there's still stereotypes and prejudice. But when we talk about dynamics of power, specifically based on the color of skin, white, there hasn't really been systemic discrimination, right? But when we talk about other groups that are minorities, for example, people of color, or if we talk about minority religions, for example, even just not being a francophone, anglophone, that also makes you a minority. There has been systemic discrimination. So that's why we say the aspect of power is important when we want to consider something as racism. Why we as an organization even sometimes say that there is prejudice towards people that are white, for example, but anti-white racism for us doesn't exist. Somebody that's white can experience racism, not because of the color of their skin, but because of their religion, the language they speak, or where they're from, right? So those two aspects for us is important to actually consider something like racism, especially when we talk about power. A quick example that I use sometimes is the NBA. Playoffs are happening right now. If you're an NBA fan, great time to be alive. You look at that system, right? You start with the first level. Let's say the players. Most of the players are black. You go higher in that hierarchy, the coaches. Now there's less black representation. Only half of the coaches are black, but there's more power and more influence. You go even higher, you talk about people that work in the offices, the administration. Very few people occupy those positions that are people of color. And then you talk about the owners. There's maybe out of 30 teams, maybe one or two owners that are black, right? So further you go in the hierarchy, there's more power, but there's less and less minorities that are represented. So again, yes, prejudice exists for everybody, but that aspect of system, of power, hierarchy is important to consider something like racism, right? And the way that racism manifests, we use the classic image of the iceberg. You know, you see the little things that are very clear to the eye, things that are extreme, right? So things that are visible. Talk about hate crimes, talk about KKK, neo-Nazis, stuff like that. Whereas in society in 2023, it's easy for us to be like, oh, that's racism, and we know it, right? The issue is that in 2023, yes, those things happen, but there's everything that's underneath, right? That's hidden, that we don't necessarily consider as racism because we're so used to seeing those things around us, hearing them, maybe even doing them and saying them ourselves, because they're so normalized, right? The classic, I'm sure everybody's heard it. I'm not racist, but we've all heard that, right? And every time I bring it up in class, all the kids laugh because they've all heard it before. It's really signifying that we know it's problematic to say this thing, and I don't want people to see me as a racist, but I'm still gonna say it anyways, right? So we know that those things are not great, but it doesn't mean that racism has disappeared. It's just taken a form that's a lot more subtle today, right? Our favorite is I'm not racist. My best friend is black. Stuff like that. That again, we've all heard before. So what we try to do is kind of focus more on the things that are underneath the water, the bigger part of the iceberg that we often leave kind of on the side because it's so normalized and it's so much a part of society. A big part of that is stereotypes. If we, oops, I forgot to mention, thankfully, we do have the law, right? I'm sure y'all have heard of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which makes it illegal basically to discriminate anybody on the basis of color of skin, religion, language, where they're from, etc. Right? And so when we talk about the things that are visible, the point of the iceberg, those are things that are easy to kind of address using the law. But when we talk about everything underneath that's hidden, the law doesn't always play a part or is necessarily a tool when it comes to deconstructing those things or having consequences, right? So when we talk about stereotypes, for example, this is a classic thing of it's not necessarily illegal, but it's still a manifestation of racism, right? So I won't go through the entire definition. I'm sure everybody understands what a stereotype is, but really quickly, it's a generalization towards an entire group where you say things like, oh, they're all like that, they all think that way, they all behave that way. But when we do that in society, when we talk about them, we're also simultaneously talking about ourselves. If we think they think that way, that means we think differently. If we think they behave that way, that means we think we behave differently. So it just separates us in society, right? The power also of stereotypes comes from the fact that they're popular, right? If I just throw out a random stereotype, all Australians are horrible singers, not a stereotype. It's a generalization because I said all Australians, but it's has no power because it doesn't exist. I just made it up, right? But if you talk about dumb blonde jokes, for example, I ask kids to finish the sentence and I just say all blondes are, and without fail, there's always going to be somebody that goes stupid or something like that, right? So there you see the power because it's something that we talk about so much because we share so much, right? Um, and you'll notice also with stereotypes that they always most of the time will attack or target the minorities, right? There's a reason why there's stereotypes about blonde hair or even like gingers, but there's no stereotypes when it comes to brown or black hair. Why? Because it's more common to have brown or black hair, right? But if you go to Sweden, for example, where the majority is blonde, but probably shouldn't say dumb blonde jokes because you get yourself in trouble, right? So it depends on the context. Um, Now, again, like I said at the beginning, you can have prejudice towards any group, but then there has to be power, there has to be hierarchy, there has to be an oppressive system. When it comes to dumb blonde jokes, personally, I don't think that there's a system of like people that are plotting against all blondes across the world. I don't think that's a thing. But if you change color of hair to, I don't know, color of skin, religion, things like that, then the consequences become a lot more grave, right? A lot more harsh. So it's important to kind of think about where stereotypes come from, right? If I ask you, and most of the time we ask kids in the class, like, oh, tell me a stereotype about Lithuanians. Most of the time they don't have anything to say. Why? Because we don't talk about Lithuanians. And then we'll ask them, we'll say Lithuania is close to Russia. And then you hear vodka, you hear Putin, you hear, I don't know, bear, AK-47, things like that. Why? Because compared to Lithuania, we talk about Russia a lot more. So it's normal that you develop stereotypes about a group because it's something that's discussed, right? So it's just to understand that stereotypes are learned idea. We're not born with those things, right? So if we learn them, we can also unlearn them, right? Which is the good news when it comes to stereotypes. So again, just thinking about where stereotypes come from. If I were to ask, I know there's not a lot of us on the Zoom side. In the YouTube side, I don't know if there's a lot of people. I'm just gonna take a look. Um,
There's 9 people.
Is nine? Oh, cool. We are in double digits. That's great. Hey. Um, if I were to ask we talk about religious groups, right? So talk about groups that we know a little bit better than Lithuania. Um, if we talk about the Jewish community, the Muslim community, and the Christian community in Canada, if I throw it out to all of y'all that are listening, who do you think is the victim of more stereotypes? You can type in the chat if you want, or yeah, probably type in the chat just to give me an idea. Who do you think between Christians, the Jewish community, and the Muslim community, who is the subject of more stereotypes? I'll give you a couple of seconds to respond. Just think about it if you feel like it. Yeah, Jewish or Muslim. I don't know if anybody's saying. I'm gonna check if somebody said something in the YouTube chat. Um, okay, cool.
Not
No,
yet.
not really. Okay. Well, I feel like it's pretty self-explanatory. Oh goodness, where did it go? Sorry guys. Technical difficulties. Trying to find you. Where did everybody go? Oh boy. I cannot, sorry guys, I can't see you anymore. Ooh, the chat, but oh, if I click on the chat button, will everybody reappear? Oh no, I can't see you anymore. I'm just gonna keep talking and I'm sure everybody can, if there's any issues, just let me know.
Yeah,
Um,
we can see you, Dylan.
yeah, I can't see y'all. I think that's the issue. I decided to minimize a thing and it just disappeared. But it's fine. It's fine. So yeah, there's definitely more stereotypes towards the Jewish community or Muslims. Why? Again, because they're minorities, right? Um, and also again, it's very easy to deconstruct. Like something that I hear it sometimes in English, more so in French, or sometimes literally people will get insulted as juif. Like in French, they'll say things like "fais pas ton juif," which is a way to be like, "Don't be cheap," right? And these generalizations are really easy to deconstruct. Like, do we know people that are not Jewish who are cheap, like my dad? Yes, there are plenty of people that are cheap that aren't Jewish, right? So it's really easy to deconstruct. If we talk about Muslims, right? If I were to ask y'all for stereotypes about Muslims, we do this interesting exercise where we ask everybody to raise their hands if they've ever heard a stereotype about Muslims. Everybody raises their hands. Then I ask, well, keep your hands raised if it's positive. Most of the time, everybody drops their hands. And it's not because they're Islamophobic or they're racist. It's because there is a surplus of stereotypes when it comes to that community, right? So the question becomes, where does this come from? Why are there that many uh, negative stereotypes or ideas when it comes to these like religious minorities, right? And there's a lot of ways you can think about it. One can just really easily be like family and friends, but I think the major player when it comes to creating these ideas is the media, right? If we want to talk about the Jewish community, it's interesting because a lot of people think that anti-Semitism is something of the past. We talk about the Holocaust, World War II, etc. For those of you that don't know, the religious communities that are most affected by hate crimes today in Canada is the Jewish community and the Muslim community. So it's still something that's relevant today. I don't know how up to date people are with music and things like that, but you may or may not have heard of the rapper Kanye West and also a basketball player Kyrie Irving, who recently had some very anti-Semitic things to say for the public, and it really led to a lot of impact, right? I think in the States, they even had like anti-Jewish protests and things like that because they were basically spewing rhetoric of the Jewish community controls everything, etc. Right? So the media plays a large role when we talk about how stereotypes are constructed. Like if we talk about Islamophobia, for example, um, the first thing that comes out when we talk about negative stereotypes towards this community is terrorism, right? Now, are there extremist groups, radicals, etc., that exist? Yes, but like like it is with any stereotypes, they can be true and false at the time. So, are there terrorist groups that are Islamist? Yes, but it is a tiny minority. There's 1.8 billion Muslims across the world, but every time we talk about this minority, um, this group, we use this teeny tiny minority that really represents less than 1% of the entire Muslim population across the world. We use this little minority to represent the entire community. And what happens is that we have, again, so many negative stereotypes towards this community. And here, there's just a few images on the PowerPoint of why we come to these ideas, right? It's always very repetitive. We always talk about the people from the Middle East, and most people from the Middle East are Muslim, but in general, they only represent 20% of Muslims across the world. Most Muslims are Asians, right? But every time you look at these magazine covers, it's always the same faces. Even when we talk about head coverings, hijabs, niqabs, things like that. If you talk about the Canadian context, yes, there are people like Muslim women that choose to wear it, but it's not everybody. So these are specific images that are continuously, repetitively used to kind of have this shock value, right? So it's important to kind of have this critical thinking when it comes to these things. And I'm sure this is something I know that in schools we talk about it a lot. It's taught a lot to students, but just to encourage not to always believe the first thing that you see online and to understand that um, communities are a lot more diverse than what we see in the news and in the media, right? So when it comes to negative stereotypes, we have to be careful and we have to deconstruct these things. But even when it comes to positive stereotypes, and this is maybe a little more tricky because when it's positive, it comes across as a compliment, and people don't necessarily uh, point the finger at these things as a generalization or a stereotype and even recognize the issue with it, right? So if I talk about, I've written here Asian community, what is this positive stereotype that y'all have heard of or is very common when we talk about Asians in general? You can use the chat again if you would like to participate. Smart. Yes, absolutely. Right? Intelligent, smart. We even have a cover from Time magazine, with kids, right? So this seems as though it can pass as a compliment. But if I were to ask, again, the audience, what could be the negative effects of this positive or so-called positive stereotype? If you're thinking about a Asian student at school, how could this stereotype negatively affect them? There you go. Yeah. Anxiety around performance, right? So sometimes I'll ask kids and I'll say like, "Hey guys, is it possible for an Asian kid to have difficulty at school?" And some of them will say no, and it's a joke. And I just say, "Guys, they're human beings, right? And they can have as much difficulty as anybody else." Sometimes we can really discourage even Asian students from going towards other interests like art, literature, and sports because we push this stereotype so heavily onto them. um, Even when students do succeed at school, the number of times we hear, it's normal, you're supposed to be good at school, you're Asian, and just kind of denying all the work and the studying it takes for them to succeed when they do succeed, right? There's also, we can look at the Black community. I like doing a little test. I've put 9 people here, well known from the Black community in North America. Who, again, using the chat, who are you able to recognize or who do you know from these 9 people? Is there anybody that you noticed or no? Drake, yeah, LeBron and Drake. So typically, these are the 2 people that people are able to recognize, right? Because when we talk about positive stereotypes, when it comes to the Black community, what does it usually circle around? Physical capacity and entertainment. What does LeBron represent? Physical capacity. What does Drake represent? Entertainment, right? So it's positive, and I don't have an issue with either of them. They succeed in their domains, but we don't shed light on all the other strengths that exist in that community. So here are the other images. We have James Baldwin, we have France Fanon, we have Angela Davis, we have Kimberly Crenshaw. The 3 women in the extreme right, they are three women on whom a film was made called Hidden Figures. They worked for NASA in the 50s or the 60s, I believe. But we only found out about them in the 2010s. Why? Because of positive stereotypes at that time, which said what about Black women? Well, they're only good for entertaining or engaging in physical activity, and that was it, right? There was no place to accept or even value um, the intellectual capacity of these women, right? So sometimes also positive stereotypes can create this kind of cage where people are complex individuals and can do more than just either be good at school or be good at sports. But it can kind of be very restrictive. Like LeBron, for example, has been told on a couple of occasions by people from the media, shut up and dribble. Because LeBron is somebody that isn't just a basketball player. He's active when it comes to social justice and things like that. So telling him to shut up and dribble is almost telling him like you can't do anything else in life. This is what you're supposed to do, entertain us with your sports, right? But there's a whole history of athletes and entertainers that have been activists for the community. We talk about Muhammad Ali, who didn't want to go to the Vietnam War, but was stripped of his championship when he decided not to go. We talk about Sam Cooke, that worked a lot with the singer, that worked a lot with Malcolm X. Colin Kaepernick, very recently, he took a knee to protest police brutality. What happened to him? He lost his place basically in the league, right? So we see the issue again with positive stereotypes. There's things that can kind of pass as compliments, but they're very reductive and they're still stereotypes at the end of the day, right? Sometimes, I know we have like a couple minutes left. I am going to quickly talk about the last few things. So microaggressions. I think this is important because when we go back to the image of the iceberg, there's so many things that are hidden and subtle, that are not extreme, and we kind of let them fly because they don't pop out to us. But when it comes to microaggressions, I like to use the example of the vase, of the overflowing vase. You know, when one drop of water doesn't bother you, but when it accumulates at some point, it's going to overflow and it's going to be overwhelming. So microaggressions from the people that say or do these things, again, they can seem very like everyday, not so serious. But from the point of view of people that receive these comments, these questions, it can be a lot. And at some point, the vase is going to overflow, right? So for me, a really easy example is when people ask me where I'm from. I'll tell them like born and raised Toronto, and then people will often ask me, well, where are you really from? Right? So if this happened to me a couple times a year or once a year, it wouldn't bother me. Just a few drops of water, right? The thing is that it happens so often to me that I don't even tell people that I'm Canadian or I'm from Toronto anymore, because I am so sick of having this interaction where just because of the color of my skin, people have difficulty accepting me as a Canadian or a Torontonian, right? So again, for the person that's asking the question, it can seem like not such a big deal, but for the people that receive these things, for them, it's not just a one time. It's something that's repetitive and accumulates, and it can get to a point where people, are overwhelmed, right? And it can come out in certain reactions. So when it comes to microaggressions, it's important with all of these things, and there's plenty of others. I invite you to go and read about them. It's having empathy for people that receive those ideas, those comments, those questions, and understanding that it can be overwhelming sometimes, right? So real quick, if I'm not mistaken, I have just a few, I know we rushed through things a little bit, just a few suggestions of things that we can do to kind of have discussions, talk about these issues. If it's for people like myself of color that are victims of these things, the first thing I put is be proud of your identity and history. So some a question I often ask kids just to help them realize is racism the problem or is it the color of the skin? And of course, racism is the problem, right? Why I say that is because the issue is not to try to change the way you dress, the way you act, the way you speak, the way you look, but it's for society to accept you for who you are, right? So to not feel like you need to adjust or change yourself just to be accepted as a person in Canadian or Quebecois society. I mentioned the charter. So just knowing that you have rights when there are situations that you're discriminated, that there is a law that you can use to protect yourself. To call out racism in your own way depends on the person. It's not always something that's easy to do. Organize and mobilize. That is more so when it comes to wanting to change laws, because sometimes laws can be problematic, even if it is the legal system. So the importance of protesting, um, uh, asking people in power to make changes, because they are the people that can make those advances in society so that we have a more egalitarian society. And then for people that are not part of racialized communities, allies, is to listen, right? Too often we're told like, oh, you're exaggerating. Are you sure it's racism? Maybe it's something else. So to really take time to recognize and to give a listening ear when somebody is sharing those experiences with you, to properly evaluate if it is racism or not, and just to listen. Um, and third one, inform and educate yourself. So there's sometimes it's my job, but if it isn't your job, it can get tiring for people from the community to have to deconstruct and talk about it constantly. And there is no lack of resources, especially today, podcasts, movies, series, books, articles all over the place. So taking the time to read, and maybe for your children, like to consume media and listen or watch things that'll help open their minds or just to see things from a different perspective. And again, to call out racism. I think when you're somebody from the community and you're being a victim of these things, it's hard to speak out because you're on the receiving end. But for somebody that's an ally that isn't necessarily the receiving at the receiving end of these things, it's important to step in to speak up for others that don't have a voice, right? Again, I know I went a little bit over time, and I rushed a little bit, but I wanted to give a lot of time for question and answers. I felt like that was the priority today, so I'm gonna end there, and I'm going to open the floor to questions. Does anybody have questions they would like to ask? Yes, Julie, I see your
Thanks.
hand. Yeah.
I have a few questions, but I'll ask one at a time. I think you did a really brilliant job of helping us identify when something is a racist comment, whether it's stereotypical, when somebody says, "Well, all bleh," right, or something.
Mm,
Like I
yeah.
think that was a very, very important thing to distinguish. I guess my question is like, as a parent,
Mm,
when I have a kid who comes home from school who says, you know, COVID has caused, the Chinese people and, caused COVID,
okay.
or, all the Russian kids are, or, you know, um, because what Israel is doing, all Jews
Right.
are,
Yeah,
like
yeah,
there's a
yeah, yeah.
lot of stuff that happens geopolitically that really the kids are hearing. And I don't, I would hope that educators have the tools in place in order to address them in the
Yeah,
moment, but not everybody does. So as a
yeah,
parent, like, yes, I could do the research, yes, I could show movies, etc. But is there like kind of an easy way to, how do you deconstruct that very quickly and and say no, that's not necessarily true? Like I
yeah,
don't know what, as a parent, I don't
mm,
really know exactly how to say that when my kid has come home and said, well, all these people are, or I heard this. So that's one
yeah,
question, and then I have another
yeah.
one.
Okay, cool. Well, I mean, I think it's going back to what the common thread with all of those things are, right? They're all stereotypes and they're all generalizations. So when it comes to the whole, I think you mentioned the Israel-Palestine conflict, where or even Russia Ukraine, where I think yes, showing other points of view where there's plenty of videos of Russians that don't agree with the conflict, or Israelis, or just people from the Jewish community that don't agree with what Israel does. So I think a simple way is to be like, not everybody thinks or acts the same, right? Which is a simple enough concept. I think that you can pass down to kids. It's like, okay, you see this conflict that is happening, but not everybody agrees with it. Which is true for a lot of things in life, right? Just because I use school sometimes. Let's say I don't know, it's Lester B. Pearson High School, and there's a kid from Lester B. Pearson High School that's committed theft, right? And then the next day in the news, all of the papers are like, "Oh, all the students from Lester B. Pearson High School are thieves." That makes no sense, right? So always just kind of bringing it back to people are individuals. We're not a monolith. Everybody thinks differently. It's not because one person does something that everybody else agrees with it or are going to do the same thing either. Right. So just kind of breaking it down to like generalizations are generalizations and they're not things that we should put stock in. I don't know if that is help. Was that a helpful answer? Yeah, okay, cool.
Yeah, I think it's I think that's helpful, just to point out, give that kind of an example to a kid and say, like, do you agree with your friends all the time? Are you the same? And I think those are very important tools. Yeah.
You had other questions. You can go for a free for all, but if it is other people have things they want to ask, or Julie, you can go for your other questions if you feel like it.
Sure.
I have, oh,
Okay.
you
No,
go,
no, it's
Julie.
okay. I already asked mine.
Okay,
I'll ask another one after you.
okay, perfect. I have a question about allyship. So, in your listing of like how to be a good ally,
Mm-hmm.
you mentioned calling out racism. Now,
Mm-hmm.
I've been in situations, either I'm a parent of a child who plays baseball, so I'm on the baseball field, or I'm in the next to the schoolyard waiting for my kids to come out, and I'll hear something, and then I'll say, I don't know if that sounded right.
Yeah, yeah,
How
yeah, yeah,
how how do I call it out, or how do I start that conversation with folks?
With folks, okay, are we talking
Yeah.
about, because I feel like it's a two-pronged thing, right? There's
Yeah.
the kids,
No,
and then
it would be
with
with another
adults.
adult.
With
Yeah,
another,
but everything is happening in front of the kids.
yeah, so they're absorbing all of these things and they're hearing all of this discourse, right? Um, it's not an easy thing to approach because I can already imagine all of the different like social dynamics that are play and things like that. I I think if there's a way in, let's say, yeah, at the baseball field, right? Some parent says something really bad and all the kids hear it. I think if there was, how I would approach it is to maybe see if there's a way you can deconstruct that with kids later on. Because I think in the moment, it might be a little explosive or it might, go off the rails if you decide to call somebody out. But it's definitely important to deconstruct those things with the kids, right? So it's an interesting dynamic sometimes where I think parents for sure transmit ideas to kids, but then the kids, you kind of have a space without the parents where you can still deconstruct those things, even if they're hearing those things at home. And you'd be surprised how, I mean, I disagree with my parents about a lot of things, my family, as far as all of these issues go, right? So you can still have that space where you take the time with the kid, I think, to deconstruct those things. With the parent, it depends on what your relationship is with the parent. Honestly, like it varies so much. If there's a space where you can be like, hey, can I take you to the side? Or you know what, I have like a individual conversation, I always feel like that's the best because sometimes when it's with so many people around, the dynamics are crazy and like sometimes like group, mob mentality plays in and you can't really have an actual conversation. So that would be how I would approach something like that is kind of take the person to a side, have a one-on-one conversation, and then take a moment with the kids, maybe the next time that they're all together to be like, hey, we heard this. Let's talk about it. What do we think about it? You know what I mean? Yeah, no problem. Other questions? Feel free. You can ask me anything. Julie, do you want to go for your second question?
Sure. Um, I guess when you were talking about how stereotypes tend to be targeted towards people who have less power,
Mm,
um, I'm not sure how to articulate the question, but there are actually stereotypes about who has the power, right? Like, so I think about, how everybody has this stereotype how Hollywood is run by Jews, right?
right.
And we know, like, just by sheer numbers, that's not true,
Yeah.
right? So people actually, will say that in a way that's disparaging, right? Like, well, it's run by Jew, and but it's not true. So again, you can break that down, but these are stereotypes that are so deep that showing evidence sometimes, I just wonder,
Yeah,
like, some of it is
for
emotional,
sure.
that yes, you can break it down and show evidence and say, well,
Absolutely.
per capita, that's just not true, blah, blah, blah. But then, you're still kind of facing this kind of emotional piece. Like,
Of course.
how do you
Yeah.
address it emotionally and not only factually?
Yeah.
Because that's, you could spew the facts until kingdom come about the Black community and
Sure.
crime
Absolutely.
and incarceration and all of those kinds of things, but there's still a very emotional reaction that people have, and I wonder, because I am Jewish and we are dealing with that,
Yeah.
increasing anti-Semitism and everything else, that sometimes countering with fact and rationale and evidence doesn't do the job, right? So how it's so frustrating, right? Because how do
I,
you address the emotional piece of that people like really fundamentally have an emotional reaction?
yeah, and we have these conversations at work as well of how we approach those comments when they come out in workshops and stuff with kids. Because, yeah, responding to emotion with facts doesn't really always take. My approach most of the time is coming from more of an empathetic perspective, of kind of like, let's put ourselves in the shoes of somebody who is Jewish, for example. Let's think about how all this anti-Semitism, all of this mistrust the community has affected them. Let's think about what it's like to be like Jewish today, right? When we talk about the things that Kanye said, like Kanye, we often say like he has 30 million followers on Twitter, and there's about 15 million Jewish people in the world. So just like that dynamic of power constantly being told that like, oh, you guys control everything and stuff like that, like how does it make somebody feel? So that's what I go for as far as trying to deconstruct when somebody's emotional. Because yeah, when it comes to facts and research, you can twist and turn it any way to make your point come across. Doesn't mean it's not important to have those numbers or data, but I always find that when those things don't work, talk about like the human experience, especially if you're somebody from that community. That I use myself a lot when I talk about racism because I think it just breaks down walls with kids
Yeah.
because oh, a real person that actually is affected by these things, right?
And I think that's very helpful because you were asking about allyship, Marika, and I think that people sometimes feel that they have to know the facts and they have to know the history and they have to know the numbers, but maybe we don't always have to know, but maybe we just have to be empathetic.
Yeah, absolutely. And so that's kind
That's
of like
very helpful.
yeah, we give ourselves a lot of pressure sometimes. It's like you can't keep up with everything. There's so many things happening and there's so much information.
Yeah.
Just yeah, talking about how it affects a person, right? How it's unfair, to not be seen as an individual and to be seen as like one as a homogenous group or something.
We do have a question from afar. I don't know
Okay.
if you saw the chat. So the
I see it.
question,
I have a question. I'm the parent
yes.
of biracial kids. Do you have resources to help parents like myself to discuss race and social equality? I could send stuff to Marika or Dan later when it comes to resources. Off the top of my head, I can't necessarily think of things like there is stuff though that you can definitely follow on Instagram, TikTok, and stuff like that, especially for your kids. Like they probably more so want to use those mediums as far as like learning and things go. Yeah, I will send Marika and Dan some TikTok accounts and Instagram accounts that they could probably follow. I'm not great at remembering those things, but there's definitely stuff that you guys can go with. Oh,
The EMSB Parents Committee has some resource packs that address specific types of anti-racism, and we can re-forward those to the parents or attach them to our YouTube if we can. We'll try and set that up.
There's also a Facebook page, Daniel, I think, for the racism committee, I can post it.
Yep, thank you.
okay, cool. Okay, cool. So you guys have resources. Cool. Right. Julie had a third question, if nobody else has.
Actually,
Oh yeah, go for it.
So it's at the um, systemic racism level. When we're talking about where the government is clearly like denying it, and then we having these discussions both with our kids and with other parents, and being able to distinguish that perspective as a minority parent. It's difficult to talk to non-minorities about the concept and how it affects us because it's an experiential thing that is
Yeah.
not necessarily that is almost unclear until it happens to you.
Right.
And I have a great example. I have my son's friend, and they joined a group together, an extracurricular activity, and the majority of the members of the extracurricular activity were non-whites or were not Caucasian.
Culturally
And
diverse.
so my son's friend finally saw like this. Oh well, I'm the minority now, and the comments. So how do we have that conversation or with our kids and with other parents?
Just kind of what you if just to clarify that, just helping them understand as somebody that doesn't experience those things.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. And so this is again like just I'm sure you all have heard of the notion of privilege, right? You don't really understand the differences until those things have been taken away from you, which is kind of the example with what with your son's friend. So like why I mentioned like listening being important, right? So even if it's something you don't understand, really taking the time to listen and give space and place to minorities in general. To, if I were to make a little tiny parallel with the Me Too movement, right? It's just we hadn't listened, period, to women when it came to harassment, like so just it sounds so simple and I don't want to oversimplify it, but the listening, right? And I think sometimes even when it comes to like movements and like activism and things like that, we just don't listen and we don't give space to the people that are affected by those things. And it's kind of like trusting minorities that they know what they're talking about. Like I mentioned it in my introduction. I worked a long time with the Inuit communities in Nunavik in northern Quebec, and a lot of the times when it came to projects or NGOs and nonprofits doing things, they would never ask the communities what they wanted. They would assume that, oh, we should do this, we should do that. And so that listening wasn't there, where they never took a moment to be like, hey, what would you like from us? What would you like us to do? And it's something that we don't practice enough in society, especially when it comes to minorities, because they're minorities and they're such a small group. Some people don't have access to somebody to hear those opinions, but I would just always go back to just listen. Honestly, just listen. And if you don't understand it, listen. And if somebody asks for a certain type of support, even if you don't get it, trust that they know what they need, right? Yeah. Other questions? Julie, are we ready for the trifecta?
No, I think my other question was around tools.
Yeah.
And I know different minority groups have various advocacy groups. I know, CEJA and the Jewish community has some amazing tools dealing with anti-Semitism. EMSB has sent out some tools around anti-Semitism and Islamophobia recently
Holocaust
that have
Museum is really great too.
Holocaust Museum is really great. So I think, and I think EMSB has done a great job raising awareness of different races, and the parent committee also addressing some systemic, what I feel is systemic racism around prayer rooms most recently and things like that. So I think we're the folks on the parent committee and in the AMSB are dealing with a lot of these things proactively. And my worry is, since these kinds of these education modules aren't, what's the word? You don't have to do them. Like they're not,
Yeah, optional.
they're optional. um, I'm not so worried about the AMSB and Lester B and City of Montreal, where we're used to where we're more used to diversity and
Yeah, yeah,
open
yeah.
and open to inclusion. I worry more about outside of Montreal and how these are being dealt with in the education system, and maybe that's a good question for Ensemble, like how, I guess I came to a question.
We figured it out.
But how broad is your reach at Ensemble in
Mm.
what you do in terms of education? And are there similar partners that you have across the province, across Canada who do this kind of work? And how do we raise awareness of those and make sure that you're in our schools and in community? That's
So
another question, my
that is
trifecta.
that's a great question. How far is our reach? Our reach is pretty far, wide reaching. Um, as far as Quebec and Montreal goes, I feel like we do. How many schools do we see a year? Like what, eight? Yeah, so we see about 40 schools, around 8,000 students a year. And it's also like, when we're in the non-for-profit sector, charities, NGOs, as far as like money goes, we're always kind of tight. So we would like to do more, but it's always like a question of like us having enough resources, right? And so that sometimes depends on who's in power and what they think is important and how much funds they want to liberate for our sectors. So we could easily, I think my colleagues all agree, see a lot more kids across the country and do so much more workshops. But yeah, just like the resources for us are limited. So it's also a question of like how much are we investing in those things, right? So that comes to more like lobbying, I guess, when it comes to these issues. Being in those rooms or those places with people that are in power and like making sure they don't forget these issues. And so that is like it's a holistic approach, right? It can't just be us. So uh it takes more partnership of just keeping links or just even they have these, I don't know what we call it in English, but table de consultation, where it's just like an assembly of organizations that all do different specificities when it comes to those things, but still have like a unified kind of front. So I think more of those is a good way of just kind of, and not just in the community sector, but also being connected with, parents associations, being connected with school boards, being connected with people from government so that there can be a proper like, view of what's going on and what is needed. And allocating resources and funds to make those things happen, right? Yeah, I don't know if that answers your question. It's very, when it comes to systemic things, it's systemic, right? And it can't be just one organization. It has to be something that is a collaborative approach on all fronts. Yeah.
Yeah,
Oh,
I think that answers my question, and but I think also it's up to us as parents to advocate for that within our school boards also,
yeah,
and
and things like this are
to
amazing. It's not often that I participate in parent cons. I love the but it shows me that there's parents that are invested, right? And again, like life is so complicated. Like I understand also if parents don't have time to do these things. And teachers, that's a whole other discussion. They're just overloaded and overworked. They don't have the training or the skill. Like they already have to teach all this curriculum and are underpaid. And then this uh, content or subject matter is a whole other kind of training that you need that they just, I don't blame teachers for not being able. Sometimes they talk to us and they're afraid of taking on certain topics because they don't have the approach that they need. And I get that, right? You don't want to mess it up, you don't want to say the wrong thing and stuff. So again, like when it comes to systemic, it has to be the entire system that puts their heads down and tries to think of something. It can't just be one arm of a society. Anything else?
I'm looking at both channels. It
Yeah, I mean,
looks
so
like
I'm just checking the YouTube chat to see if there's anything.
well, I think that it was a great way to end. That's for sure. We
Oh,
have more work to do,
yeah, yeah.
but we did learn a lot. I know I did today.
Awesome.
So I guess we'll wrap it up. Thank you so much for your great talk, I think, and the great conversation. So thank you to everyone in the Zoom room and on the YouTube feed for your engagement. Thank you, Dylan, for all your insights on the topic. And a big shout out goes to all of our Lunch and Learn presentation partners. So we applaud you. We want to thank all of the local community partners who've contributed to ParentCon 2023. A big thank you to all of our speakers and staff members, and a thank you to everyone here and everyone on the YouTube space, and for all the people who will be watching in the future. Remember to follow us on our Facebook page, EMSB Parents. We have a website, emsbparents.ca, and we have a YouTube channel. Just look up EMSB Parents. Thank you and have a great afternoon, and we'll see you at the next Lunch and Learn.
All right. Have a great day, guys. Thank you for being here and participating.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Recording stopped.